The report came in at 0340 Imperial Standard Time, which was the kind of hour when junior officers made filing errors and nobody checked twice. Scout Vessel 7 Talon had been running a routine sweep of the Outer Rim Sector 9, Quadrant Fallow, the dead edge of mapped space where nothing lived and nothing happened, and the biggest excitement in 3 years had been a rogue comet that turned out to be a rogue comet, the kind of posting they gave officers who had made one too many small mistakes, a punishment disguised as an assignment. The report should have auto-filed. It didn't. The system sat on it for 4 seconds, an eternity in Imperial processing terms, then kicked it up. The chain with a single flag attached, not a red flag, not a yellow one, a flag the duty officer on the overnight shift had never seen before, white, blank, the system's way of saying, I don't have a category for this. The duty officer, a young Veeth named Prex, stared at the flag for a long time. Then he did what any sensible junior officer would do at 0340 when presented with something he didn't understand. He escalated it. Admiral Vex Carr did not sleep well on the best nights, and this was not a best night. His quarters aboard the command station, Eternal Reach, were quiet and cold the way he liked them, but his mind had been running tactical models since midnight, old habit, the kind you don't stop even after 30 years of command. So when the comm chimed at 0412, he was already sitting up. He read the report twice. Small yellow star. 1 inhabited planet, 3rd orbital position, carbon-based atmosphere, bipedal dominant life, population estimate. Unclear. Sensors kept returning different numbers each pass, which sensors were not supposed to do. Technological index, unclear. No transponder signals, no registered fleet activity, no diplomatic record, no colonial claim from any recognized Empire member state. He read the last line 3 times. Classification attempt, failed. Cross-reference result not in records. Vex Carr had been in the Imperial fleet for 31 years. He had cataloged dead worlds and living ones. He had processed first contact with 11 species across 4 sectors. He had personally overseen the expansion of the Imperial Registry to its current count of 4,712,006 star systems, a number he knew by heart the way other men knew their children's birthdays. There was no system at that coordinate in those records. That was not possible. He dressed in the dark, not because the lights bothered him, because he needed the minute it took to button a uniform in darkness, needed to think. A database error. Had to be. The Outer Rim archives were old. Some of them migrated 3 or 4 times across different storage formats over the centuries. Data got corrupted, entries got dropped. It happened, rarely, but it happened. He would send a second scout. The second scout would file a proper report. The entry would be created. The number would become 4,712,007. He told himself that with the calm of a man who had never once had to tell it to himself before. The second scout went out at 0600. Standard 2-person crew, long-range sensors, orders to do a full-spectrum pass and return with a complete planetary profile within 72 hours. It came back in 19. The crew, both of them, were sitting very straight when they docked. The kind of straight that wasn't discipline. The kind that was what the body does when it has decided, on its own, to be very still. Vex Carr met them in the debriefing room personally. He didn't usually do that for scout reports. He pulled the chair out across the table from them and sat down and looked at them and said nothing. The senior scout, a doll named Veth Oren, who had been running Outer Rim routes for 12 years without incident, put her hands flat on the table and said, "They were already watching us when we arrived, sir." Vex Carr said, "Explain." "We dropped out of transit at the outer edge of the system. Standard approach distance, far enough for passive observation. Before we ran a single active scan, before we pinged anything, we picked up targeting locks, 12 of them, from assets we could not visually locate. You were locked by ships you couldn't see. Couldn't locate on any spectrum we ran. They weren't cloaked, sir. Cloaking has a signature. These had no signature. They were just." She stopped. "Not there, until they were." The junior scout, who had said nothing, said quietly. Vex Carr looked at him. "They had locks on us for 6 hours, sir. We ran passive scans. We took readings. They watched us take readings. When we turned to leave, the locks released. Clean, all at once. Like a door being opened." The room was quiet. Vex Carr said, "Was there any communication attempt?" Veth Oren put a data chip on the table between them and slid it across. "1 transmission," she said. 40 minutes into our observation window, we didn't respond. We didn't know what it was at first. It came in on a frequency we don't actively monitor. It took the system 11 minutes to even identify it as a directed communication rather than ambient signal. What was it? She looked at the chip. Then at him. "Text only, sir. Imperial Standard. Clean grammar. No dialect variants. No translation artifacts. Whoever sent it either speaks it natively or has had a very long time to practice." He picked up the chip. He didn't look at it yet. "What did it say?" "4 words, sir." She said the 4 words. We've been waiting. Vex Carr sent the cruiser. Bright Dominion. 2 days later, not a scout, a proper cruiser, 400 crew, full weapons complement, enough firepower to crack a moon. He told Captain Drevsol to make the approach visible. No quiet observation. Come in with full transponder broadcast. Standard Imperial fleet formation. Run the contact protocol, the way the book said to run it. He wanted to see what a show of force looked like from the other side. The Bright Dominion was gone for 8 days. It came back intact, every crew member accounted for. No damage to the hull, no weapons fired, no casualties. Vex Carr looked at Drevsol in the debrief room, and Drevsol was a man who had done 2 combat tours and put down a colonial uprising with his own hands and was not by any definition a man who rattled. He was rattled. They met us, Drevsol said. 1 ship. Came out to the edge of the system and just held position. No weapon signature, no shields up. Just sitting there in open space like they were waiting for a bus. What did they look like? The ship? Nothing in any registry. Long hull design, dark material, no visible propulsion ports. Which means either they're hiding the ports or the propulsion system is something we don't have a file on. Vex Carr kept his voice flat. And we ran the contact protocol. Hailed them on all standard frequencies. They responded on the first try, sir. Not after a delay, immediately. Like they had the protocol memorized. Drevsol paused. They might have the protocol memorized. What was said? They asked us to state our intentions. We gave the standard Imperial introduction, registry number, diplomatic designation, Empire representation. All of it. Another pause. They knew our registry number before we gave it. The room was very quiet again. Vex Carr was beginning to hate the quiet. They read back our registry number to us, Drevsol said, and then they asked, politely, sir, very politely, if we were there for the scheduled meeting or if this was an unplanned visit. The scheduled, we have no scheduled meeting with this system, sir. I checked. There is no system at those coordinates in any record. There is no scheduled meeting. There has never been a diplomatic exchange with. I know, Vex Carr said. Drevsol looked at him. I know there's no record, Vex Carr said. What else? Their lead diplomat came aboard, voluntarily. Asked permission first, waited for it to be granted, came across on her own shuttle. She sat in our conference room for 3 hours. She had tea. She was calm, sir. The kind of calm that made my senior staff feel like they were the ones being evaluated. He reached into his uniform pocket and put something on the table. A card. Small, pale material, not quite paper. On it, in Imperial Standard, a name and a title. Commander Yara Osei, Earth Diplomatic and Military Liaison. Earth. Vex Carr picked up the card. It was warm somehow, even though it had been in Drevsol's cold pocket for 8 days. She left that, Drevsol said. Said to give it to whoever was in charge of the investigation. Said, and I'm quoting directly here, sir. Tell them we're not hard to find. We just needed to know if they were ready to look. Vex Carr turned the card over. On the back, in very small letters, the same coordinate his scouts had first reported. The blank one. The one not in the records. And below it, one more line. We've known yours for a long time. That night, if you called it night, aboard a station that cycled artificial light on a 26-hour clock, Vex Carr stood at the viewport of his office and looked at the stars and did something he had not done in a very long time. He thought about what he didn't know. The Empire's power was information, not just military strength information. 4.7 million cataloged systems, thousands of species indexed, classified, ranked by development tier and threat assessment. The registry was not just a database, it was the Empire's proof of itself. You are known, therefore you exist in relation to us. You are ranked, therefore you are understood. You are understood, therefore you are manageable. A thing not in the records was not a thing. Except this thing had sent ships into Imperial space without triggering a single border sensor, had placed targeting locks on Imperial scouts without any detectable technology, had a diplomatic liaison who showed up aboard an Imperial cruiser and drank tea and left a business card like she was attending a trade fair, had been waiting. His reflection in the viewport looked the same as always. Square jaw, the gray that had come in at his temples 3 years ago, the particular set of the eyes that officers under his command called the look among themselves. The expression that meant he had decided. Something in the deciding was already done. The reflection was lying to him. He hadn't decided anything. He didn't have enough pieces. He pulled up the original scout report on his desk terminal. Read it again. The part that kept snagging wasn't the missing records, that he could almost explain. Archival error, ancient data loss, fringe of map space. What he couldn't explain was the debris field, or rather, the absence of one. Every inhabited system the Empire had ever cataloged had a debris field. It was a byproduct of early-stage space activity, spent propulsion casing, Dead satellites, the wreckage of test vehicles and failed launches, the accumulated litter of a species learning how to leave its own atmosphere. You could estimate a civilization's technological age within a century just by reading the density of its debris field. This system had none. Not thin, not sparse. None. Either this species had never had a space program, which did not match the ships that had locked onto his scouts, the shuttle that had docked with Bright Dominion, the diplomat who had crossed open space in a vessel that ran on something Imperial sensors couldn't read, or someone had cleaned it up, every piece of it, deliberately. He stood at the viewport for a long time. The stars didn't move. They never did. That was the thing about them. You could build empires in the space between them, catalog every rock and gas cloud and spinning dead world, fill 7 million records with names and ranks and threat assessments. And something could still be sitting out there, in the space between the known things, watching the empire build, waiting. He picked up the card again. Earth. He had never heard that word before tonight. In 31 years of Imperial service across 4.7 million cataloged systems, he had never once encountered that word. It sat in his hand like a stone. He put it in his pocket, not in a file, not in a report, his pocket. Then he went to his desk and began writing the briefing that would wake up Imperial intelligence in the morning. And he chose his words very carefully, because some part of him, the part that had survived 31 years by knowing when the ground was changing, under his feet, understood that the way he wrote this briefing would matter, that things were moving, that they had been moving for a long time, and that he, Admiral Vexkar, senior fleet commander of the Galactic Empire, had not been the one to start them. Director Sorenel had a rule about sleep. She slept 6 hours, not 5, not 7, 6 at the same time every night, in a room with no comm access and no terminals. She had kept that rule for 22 years because the work of Imperial intelligence was the kind of work that ate people who didn't have rules. She had watched it happen. Brilliant analysts who stopped sleeping, stopped eating right, stopped having anything in their lives that wasn't the work. They burned fast and they burned complete and then they were gone. And the work remained, indifferent, 6 hours every night. Vexkar's briefing arrived at 060 Road. She read it at 0601. She did not sleep again for 4 days. The intelligence archives were not in one place. That was by design, information distributed across 11 separate secure facilities, each one holding pieces, none of them holding the whole picture. To run a full cross-reference, you had to pull access from all 11 simultaneously, and the process left a record, and the record was reviewed. And the review meant that whatever you were looking for would eventually be known by people beyond yourself. Sorenel pulled access from all 11 at 0700 and didn't care who reviewed it. She started with the astronomical records, not the current registry, the deep archive. Raw data going back 2,000 years, before the registry was the registry, back when the Empire was still 3 systems arguing about trade routes and the cataloging project was a single scholar with a telescope and a lot of optimism. She was looking for Earth, or rather she was looking for the hole where Earth should have been. She found it in 40 minutes, which was faster than she expected and much slower than it should have been possible. The first signal was 847 years old, a radio transmission. Primitive technology, the kind of thing a pre-spaceflight species generates accidentally just by running electrical equipment and broadcasting entertainment signals into the atmosphere. The kind of thing that bleeds into space in all directions like light from a window. You couldn't miss it with a functioning sensor array. The Imperial sensor array at the nearest relay station at that time had logged it, auto-flagged it, routed it to the contact assessment queue, where it sat for 6 weeks. Then it was reclassified. Origin, stellar interference, non-artificial, no action required. Sorenel stared at that reclassification for a long time, because stellar interference did not produce structured signals with repeating mathematical intervals. Any second-year intelligence analyst could tell the difference. Whoever had reclassified that signal had either been catastrophically incompetent or had been something else entirely. She pulled the reclassification record, found the analyst ID, ran the ID. The file came back clean. A Geth analyst named Voss Rin, 40-year career, no disciplinary record, retired with commendation. She pulled his full personnel file and read it twice, and nothing was wrong with it. Nothing was wrong in the way that everything being right is sometimes more suspicious than something being wrong. A file without a single rough edge, without one missed day or minor reprimand or personnel note that said, occasionally difficult in meetings. Real careers had texture. This one was smooth. She flagged it and kept pulling. There were more. That was the thing. That was the thing that made her stop, twice, and sit very still at her terminal with her hands in her lap. Not because she was frightened. She was but because she needed to not move for a moment and let the shape of what she was seeing settle into something she could hold. The signals came in waves, not constant, spaced across centuries, the way a species' technological development actually progresses. Primitive radio, then more complex broadcasts, then something that read as early propulsion testing, then the electromagnetic signature of nuclear energy. Then, about 200 years ago, the first traces of what might have been early faster-than-light experiments. Each wave, at exactly the point it should have triggered Imperial Contact Protocol, had been reclassified. 17 times over 800 years. Different analysts, different relay stations, different sectors of the outer rim as the signal spread, but always the same result. A flag that should have started a contact assessment, quietly turned into a notation about stellar interference or equipment calibration or data corruption, and filed away where no one would look at it again. 17 separate people across 8 centuries making the same quiet wrong call. That was not coincidence. Coincidence was one person, maybe two. Coincidence did not sustain itself across 17 instances and 800 years without breaking once, without a single analyst asking a question or raising a concern or leaving a note that said, "Something feels off about this." 17 people had seen Earth and 17 people had looked away. She pulled every personnel file, read all of them. Most were Geth, a few Dahl, 2 Veeth, long careers, clean records, unremarkable retirements. The smooth file pattern held across all of them. She lined them up on her secondary screen. 17 faces, 17 clean careers, and looked at them the way she looked at things when she was trying to find what they had in common. She almost missed it. Not in the faces. She wasn't looking for something that obvious. She was looking at the dates, service dates specifically, when each analyst had been assigned to the relay station or sector where they'd processed the Earth-adjacent signal. The assignments had not been random. The assignments were lateral transfers, every one of them. Someone posted to a relay station from another post, or from a desk assignment, or from a training program. In each case, the transfer paperwork was routine. In each case, the transfer had been processed by a different mid-level logistics coordinator somewhere in the Empire's sprawling administrative body. She started pulling the logistics coordinators. She found 6 of them. She almost kept going. Almost pulled those files the same way she'd pulled the others, when something made her stop. A different instinct. The one that had kept her alive in this job when the clean, analytical approach would have walked her into a wall. She ran the 6 logistics coordinators through facial composite analysis instead of personnel records. Stripped out the ID numbers and the career histories and the commendations. Just faces against the biometric database. One of them came back with a flag, not a match to another Imperial employee. A match to a physical profile type that the biometric database categorized, for lack of a better file. Unclassified bipedal outer rim. She sat with that result for a very long time. Then she locked her terminal, put a level 6 security hold on everything she'd accessed in the last 6 hours, and walked to the window of her office. Outside, the station's rotation brought the star field into view. Slow, steady, the same stars she had looked at from this window for 9 years. She had spent those 9 years building what she privately considered the most complete picture of the galaxy's intelligence landscape that any single person had ever held. She knew which species were lying to the Empire about their military capabilities. She knew which trade agreements were fronts for resource extraction. She knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally, across a dozen member states. She had been proud of that. The pride had a specific shape now. The shape of someone who had been allowed to know a great many things while being kept very carefully away from the one thing that mattered. A human. And she was already calling it that, already using the word from the briefing. The word from the card. A human had sat in an Imperial logistics office somewhere and routed personnel transfers for the better part of a career. Had put the right people in the right positions at the right moments. Had turned 800 years of careful coverage into something so clean it looked like empty space. She thought about what that took. Not the intelligence, the patience, the willingness to move slowly, one small piece at a time. Never rushing, never overcorrecting, trusting the process over decades and generations. The Empire moved fast. The Empire had always moved fast because speed was power, and power was the point. Something had been moving slowly right beside them. And they had never noticed because they weren't looking for slow. On Earth, though Sorenel would not know this, would not know any of it until much later. Would reconstruct it afterward from records and testimony, the way you reconstruct a fire from the shape of the ash. General Dao Wei was eating. Breakfast, rice, plain. A habit from childhood that had survived 63 years and 2 careers and the particular exhaustion of being the man who knew the most about the longest plan anyone had ever made and could not tell anyone about it. His aide came in at 0730 with the morning brief. Satellite feeds, diplomatic traffic, the usual spread of information that told him what the Empire was doing and how fast they were doing it. He read the relevant line, looked at the date, put down his chopsticks. He had a bottle on the shelf above his desk, something amber, something old, something he had been given by his predecessor with instructions not to open it until the day the Empire finally looked. He took it down, poured 2 glasses, small ones, the kind you pour when you're marking something, not celebrating it. He drank one, left the other on the desk, looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up his comm and started making calls, and his voice was the same voice it always was, quiet, unhurried, a little tired, and everyone who received those calls understood that the next phase had begun. Back in her office, Soren L. pulled up a report template and stared at the blank header for a while. She knew what she had found. She knew what it meant. A network, patient, distributed, multi-generational, embedded inside the Empire's own administrative body, not espionage in the traditional sense. No stolen secrets, no sabotage systems, no assassinations, just a very long, very quiet act of misdirection. Look here, not there, file this wrong. Transfer that person. Let the machinery of a fork 7 million system empire process 1,000 routine tasks and never notice the one thing those tasks were designed to hide. She knew who she needed to tell. Vex Carr, the Praetor's office, the full council. She also knew that somewhere in the chain between herself and those destinations, there might be another smooth-filed employee with a face that didn't match their records. She had found one. She had found the coordinator because she ran composites instead of files. She had not run composites on anyone else. She had not run them on anyone in the current active intelligence staff. Had not run them on the Praetor's administrative office, or the fleet logistics corps, or the communications relay teams. She had found one. There might be more. She sat with that for a long time. Sat with the particular weight of being a woman who had spent her career knowing things, and now could not be certain that the tools she used to know, things were clean. Then she did what she always did when the problem was bigger than she could hold in one sitting. She broke it into pieces. First piece, the report, written carefully, specific facts, no speculation, no interpretation beyond what the data directly supported. She would write what she found and not what she thought it meant. Second piece, verification. Before she sent anything to anyone, she would run composites on every current employee with access to her report's distribution chain. If there were more smooth-faced logistics coordinators with unclassified bipedal profiles sitting in Imperial intelligence, she would find them before they found her report. Third piece, the question she was not ready to write down yet, but which was already sitting in the back of her mind waiting, the way difficult questions always waited. Not, how did this network exist? Not, how many of them are there? The real question, what were they waiting for? Because that was the thing about a network this patient, this careful, this committed to the long view. You didn't build something like this without knowing what the ending looked like. You didn't place people inside an empire for 800 years and keep that secret intact across generations without having a very clear picture of what all of it was for. The cover-up wasn't the plan, it was the preparation. And if the empire was only now noticing, only now looking, only now reading a card that said, "We've known yours for a long time," then the preparation was over. She started writing. Outside her window, the stars held their positions the way they always did, indifferent, patient, full of things not yet in any record. The War Council met on the 3rd day. Not because 3 days was the right amount of time to understand what they were dealing with. 3 days was nowhere near enough time for that. 3 days was the amount of time it took for the Praetor's office to stop pretending this was an intelligence matter and start treating it as what it actually was, a political one. Praetor Maleth Un arrived last, the way he always did, not because he was late. Because arriving last meant everyone was already seated when you walked in, and everyone already seated meant everyone already aware of who the room belonged to. 22 years of leading the Empire had given him a very precise understanding of which small things communicated large truths, and the order of entry into a room was one of them. He sat, looked at the faces around the table. Vex Carr at his left, expression unreadable. Soren L. at the far end, a data tablet face down in front of her, which meant she had things to say that she had not yet put in a formal report, which meant she was being careful, which meant she was more concerned than she was willing to write down. He noted that, filed it. "Admiral," he said. Vex Carr stood and gave the summary cleanly, the way Vex Carr always did. No decoration, no cushioning, just the sequence of facts in the order they had occurred. The blank coordinate, the scouts, the cruiser, the card, the transmission. He put the card itself on the table at the end and left it there. The council looked at it. Nobody touched it. Maleth Un said, "Options." Vexcar had 3. He laid them out the same way, clean, ordered, undecorated. First, diplomatic contact. Send a formal delegation. Establish communication through proper channels. Treat this as a standard first contact scenario. Acknowledge the anomaly in the records as an administrative oversight. Proceed as though the situation were normal. Second, blockade. Position a fleet at the system's edge. No engagement, no invasion, a show of presence. Force the other side to respond to Imperial terms rather than setting their own. Third, preemptive military action. The system had one inhabited planet. Imperial fleet strength in the region was sufficient. A Tier 3 conflict by every metric. Quick, manageable, low cost. The numbers were on the table. Fleet strength, estimated planetary population, projected engagement duration, resource expenditure. Clean columns of figures that turned a situation with no good answer into something that looked like arithmetic. Councillor Dreth Von, who had been running military appropriations for 11 years and thought in budgets, looked at the third column and said, "The preemptive option is the most efficient use of. The numbers are wrong." Sorenelle said it without standing up, without raising her voice. The flat delivery of someone stating a fact they had already verified twice. The table looked at her. She picked up her tablet, turned it over, did not look at it. She had already memorized everything on it. The population estimate is based on atmospheric sensor readings and surface thermal signature mapping. Both of those methods assume the population is distributed the way populations are normally distributed. Concentrated in urban centers, stable, not moving. If a population is in active relocation, both methods return numbers that are too low by a significant margin. She paused. The fleet registry is based on transponder detection. Their ships do not carry transponders. Our registry does not reflect their actual fleet strength. It reflects the number of their ships we have been able to locate, which is a different number and probably a much smaller one. The table was quiet. Every figure in the third column, she said, is derived from data collection methods that this particular civilization appears to have specifically designed around. The numbers are not wrong by accident. They are wrong because we have been handed wrong numbers. Drethvon said, "That's a significant claim without. I found 17 instances of deliberate signal misdirection going back 800 years, Sorenelle said. I found at least one human asset embedded in Imperial administration. I have not finished looking, which means there may be more. Which means I cannot tell you with confidence that any data channel we use to compile these estimates is clean." She put the tablet down. "The numbers are wrong." Melathun had been watching her. He looked at Vexcar. Vexcar's expression had shifted. Something behind the eyes that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite discomfort. Something that had been there since he'd walked in, Melathun realized. Something he had brought with him from 3 days of reading scout reports and holding a small, warm card in his pocket. "The blockade," Melathun said. "Option 2, we position, we observe, we do not engage." Sorenelle said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. The blockade fleet was 17 ships, enough to make the point clearly. Enough that no reasonable assessment of the situation would look at those 17 ships and see anything other than the full weight of Imperial intent. It took 4 days to position. On the 5th day, the fleet dropped out of transit at the edge of the system, and Admiral Vexcar, watching from the command station via tight beam relay, received the first report from Fleet Captain Orav Dayan within minutes of arrival. He read the report, read it again. Then he sat very still for a moment, his hands flat on his desk, and looked at nothing in particular. The planet was there. Third orbital position, yellow star, the coordinates that matched the blank record exactly. It was there. The atmosphere was intact. The landmasses were present. The oceans, the weather systems, the cloud cover, all of it there. The people were not. Captain Orav Dayan's voice on the relay was professionally steady in the way that people's voices are when they are working very hard at being professionally steady. "We are reading no life signs on the planetary surface," she said. "No concentrations of any scale. We have run 6 passes at multiple altitudes and the result is consistent. The surface is empty of its population." Vexcar said, "The moon installation? Also empty. But sir, the installation is running. Fully powered, all systems active. Environmental controls maintaining habitable temperature and atmosphere throughout. The lights are on." A pause that lasted slightly too long. "It looks occupied. Everything functions as though people just stepped out. There is prepared food in the facility's kitchen that is still warm." Vexcar closed his eyes, opened them. "The ships? Gone, sir. We are detecting no vessels in the system. The ships that locked onto our scouts, the ship that escorted our cruiser, nothing. No transponder signal, no engine wash, no residual heat signatures. They left clean. How long ago?" The pause this time was longer. "Based on the food temperature, sir, we think within the last 6 hours. But that's not." She stopped. "That's not possible." The population of this planet, based on everything we observed, was in the hundreds of millions. You cannot move hundreds of millions of people in 6 hours. You cannot move them in 6 days. The infrastructure required, the number of ships, the coordination, sir, this should have taken years. The relay hummed quietly. Vexker said, "What did the surface look like?" Intact, completely. City standing, infrastructure in place, power grids still running. No signs of evacuation panic, no abandoned vehicles blocking roads. No crowding damage in transport hubs. The places where people waited to board transport, we could find them, sir. By the pattern of foot traffic in soft ground, by the arrangement of things left behind. They were orderly. They knew where to go, and they went there. They left their cities intact because, she stopped again. Because what, Captain? Because they plan to come back, sir. That's the only reason you leave a city intact, and the lights on when you're leaving. You leave it like that because you expect to return. Vexcar forwarded the report to Sorenel and the Praetor's office simultaneously. Sorenel's response came back in 8 minutes. "I need more time." The Praetor's office took 4 hours. Then Malethune himself came on the relay, and his voice was the same voice it always was, composed, weighted, carrying the particular gravity of a man who had spent 22 years being the last word on every subject. "Analysis," he said. Vexcar said. "They knew we were coming. The blockade decision was made 4 days ago in a secured council chamber. They were moving before that, possibly before the council met at all, possibly before we positioned the first scout." Silence on the relay. "They were watching the council chamber?" "I don't know, sir. What I know is that the timing is not coincidental." Another silence. Longer. "Where are they?" "Unknown." The silence after that one was the longest. Vexcar could hear the shape of it. The Praetor processing what it meant for a population in the hundreds of millions to be, simply, unknown. To have stepped off a planet and into blank space and left no trail that 17 Imperial ships could find. "What do they want?" Malethon said. "I think," Vexcar said carefully, "that they want us to ask that question." The transmission came 40 minutes later. It arrived on a standard Imperial communication frequency, properly formatted, routed through the relay network with a transmission ID that the system logged without error. Clean, professional. The kind of transmission that came from someone who understood exactly how to send a message through Imperial infrastructure. Captain Orevdan forwarded it to Vexker without comment, which was comment enough. It was text only, short. The sender ID listed a name he already knew. Commander Yara Ose, Earth Diplomatic and Military Liaison. And a set of coordinates. Deep space, outer rim, far from the empty planet and the lit-up moon and the cities with their power grids still running. Below the coordinates a time, 12 hours, and then 2 lines. "Come if you want to understand. Don't if you'd rather keep guessing." Vexcar read it on his terminal. Then he walked to the viewport and stood there the way he had stood 3 days ago, looking at stars. Except now the stars were different. Now he knew that somewhere among them, moving through the dark on ships with no transponders and no engine signatures, were hundreds of millions of people who had rehearsed this, who had known their route and their timing and their role. Before the Empire had ever sent a single scout to look at them, he thought about what Orevdan had said. You leave it like that because you expect to return. Not fleeing, repositioning. He thought about the transmission, the tone of it, not threatening, not pleading, patient. The specific patience of someone who has been waiting a very long time, and is now, finally, at the part of the plan where the waiting ends. He forwarded the transmission to Malethune with 1 line attached. Recommendation, attend. The Praetor's response came back in 20 minutes. Send a drone. Vexcar read that, put it down, picked it up again, read it again. Then he walked to his personal shuttle bay and told his pilot to plot the coordinates and did not send a second message to the Praetor's office, and did not ask for authorization, and did not think too long about what he was doing, because if he thought too long about what he was doing, he would do the sensible thing instead of the necessary one. The shuttle launched at 0300. 12 hours. He had been wrong about things before. He had made calls that cost ships, that cost lives, that he still measured himself against in the small hours of the morning when the tactical models ran behind his eyes like old film. He had been wrong. He did not think he was wrong about this. Whatever was at those coordinates, it was not a trap. Traps didn't leave their cities with the lights on. Traps didn't send politely worded invitations with choices attached. Whatever was at those coordinates had been built for this exact moment. He sat in the back of his shuttle as it accelerated into the dark, and outside the small window the stars moved the way they always did, not at all. And somewhere ahead of him, in space that was not in any record, something was waiting. It had always been waiting. He was only now beginning to understand what for. The station had no business being there. That was the first thing Vex Carr thought when it came into view, not, "What is that?" or, "How large is it?" but the simple structural wrongness of its existence in this particular patch of space. The outer rim was old dark and empty dark, and the kind of dark that had been dark since before the Empire had a name for itself. Nothing was built out here. Nothing had reason to be. The station was built out here. It was large. Not in the way Imperial stations were large. Not the aggressive bulk of military engineering. Not the sprawl of a trade hub. Large the way old things were large. Like it had been here long enough to settle into the space around it. The material of its hull was dark. Not the dark of absence, but the dark of something that had absorbed a great deal of light over a very long time. It had no visible weapons ports, no defensive array, no fleet of escort ships holding position around it. It sat in the black like it had nothing to prove. Vex Carr's pilot brought the shuttle in slow, which was the right call. There was a docking signal broadcasting on a frequency the shuttle's system recognized. Imperial Standard, again, that small detail that kept sitting wrong. And a docking bay that opened as they approached, as though they had been expected, which they had been, which Vex Carr was starting to understand, was going to keep being true about everything. They docked. The bay was clean and warm and lit with a soft light that wasn't quite like Imperial station lighting. Warmer, somehow, less clinical. There was gravity, properly calibrated. There was air, properly mixed. Both of which meant this station had been built with Imperial physiology in mind, or had been adjusted for it, either of which was its own kind of statement. He stepped out of the shuttle. Sorenelle was already there. She was standing at the bay entrance with her arms at her sides and her face doing something it almost never did. Nothing. Not composed. Not calculating. Just present. She looked at him the way people look at each other when they have separately arrived at the same place by different roads, and the coincidence of it is not quite funny. "The Praetor sent you too," he said. "The Praetor sent a drone," she said. "I came myself." He looked at her. "I've been looking for embedded assets for 3 days," she said. "I found 3 more. I don't know how many I haven't found yet. I needed to understand what we're dealing with before I put anything else in writing." She paused. "Also, the drone would have been a mistake." "I know," he said. They went in together. The first corridor was plain. Dark walls, soft light, the particular quiet of a large space with good acoustic absorption. Vex Carr walked and said nothing, and Sorenelle walked beside him and said nothing, and the corridor opened into the first room, and they both stopped. It was a hall, wide enough that the far walls were slightly soft with distance, high-ceilinged. The light came from sources that weren't visible, distributed even, like daylight without a sun, along both walls, cases, floor to ceiling, behind the cases objects, documents, images, things he didn't recognize yet and things he did. He recognized them because they were Imperial. That was the second wrong thing, after the station's existence. The objects in the cases were Imperial weapons, Imperial insignia, Imperial administrative documents in the specific format the Empire had used during its first expansion period, 400 years ago. Artifacts from the Veeth annexation, a flag from the Dahl consolidation, a treaty document with a burn mark along one edge, the same burn mark that appeared in historical records of the Outer Colony disputes, because one of the signing parties had tried to destroy their copy before it could be enforced. He had read about that treaty in his first year at the Imperial Academy. It had been presented to him as a story about the importance of ironclad documentation. The original was in a case 6 feet from his left hand. He kept walking. Because walking felt like the only appropriate response to a room that kept producing things that had no right to be here. The hall divided. One wing to the left, a label above the entrance in 3 languages. Imperial Standard first, then 2 he didn't recognize. He read the Imperial Standard. The Veeth. He knew what the Veeth were, everybody knew. A species from the Inner Rim, early in the Empire's expansion. They had resisted annexation. There had been a conflict. The conflict had been resolved. That was how history books described it. The conflict was resolved. He had always understood, in the way that adults understood things they had been children when they were taught. That resolve was doing significant work in that sentence. He walked into the Veeth wing. There were testimonies. Printed, physical, mounted behind glass, in Veeth script, which he couldn't read, but with Imperial Standard translations below each one. He read 3, stopped reading. Not because they were difficult to read. Because they were easy, clear, specific, first-hand accounts written in plain language. And the plain language described things that he had never seen in any document in any Imperial archive big. As the Imperial archives did not contain plain language about this particular subject. The conflict had not been resolved, the Veeth had been destroyed, not annexed, Not absorbed, destroyed, systematically and completely, over a period of 11 years, and then removed from the record, with the same patient thoroughness that someone had used to remove Earth from the record, except this time the thoroughness had been imperial, and what was being removed was not a secret to protect but a shame to bury. He stood in the Vth wing for a while, then he walked out and kept going. There were others, a wing for each. Names he knew as historical footnotes, species described in Academy texts as pre-expansion tier, absorbed or defunct. Each wing with its objects, its documents, its testimonies. Each wing labeled with two things, a name and a date. The date was the date of the last record. Sorenelle walked beside him through all of it. She didn't speak. She was doing what she always did, taking it in, filing it, building the picture. But her pace had slowed since the third wing. And once, just once, she stopped completely in front of a mounted photograph. A large one, taking up most of one wall. A city that had been a city and was not anymore. And stood there long enough that he had moved several steps ahead before he noticed she wasn't. Beside him, he waited. She caught up, said nothing, kept walking. He didn't say anything either. Some things didn't need to be named. At the end of the museum there was a final wing. No label above the entrance. He almost walked past it before he noticed the absence of a label where every other wing had one. He went in, empty cases, clean floors, the same soft light as everywhere else. The display cases were the right size, mounted at the right heights, arranged in the same configuration as the other wings. Everything prepared, everything ready, waiting for contents that had not yet been placed. He counted the cases. He stopped counting. Enough, Sorenelle said from behind him. Her voice was completely level, the kind of level that required effort. He turned. She was looking at the cases too. Then she sat down on the floor. Not collapsed. Not distress in the dramatic sense. She just sat down cross-legged, in the middle of the empty wing, and looked at the empty cases, and stayed very still. He didn't tell her to stand up. He stood beside her and looked at the same cases and tried to do the same math she was doing, and arrived at the same place. There was a right number of cases. The number was not random. You're counting wrong. The voice came from behind them, quiet, unhurried, an old man's voice, not weak, just worn, the way wood wears to smoothness over time. Vex's car turned. He was shorter than expected, older than expected. He wore plain clothes, no uniform, no insignia. He had the kind of face that had once been sharp and had gone soft at the edges, without going soft underneath, if that distinction meant anything, and somehow it did. He was carrying a thermos and 2 cups, and he looked completely like someone who had been expecting visitors for a while, and was glad they had finally arrived. The cases aren't a count of individuals, the old man said. He set the cups down on the floor near Sorenelle, just put them there, without ceremony, without asking, and poured from the thermos. The smell of it reached Vex's car before he could name it. Something warm. Something he didn't have a word for. Their account of something else. I won't tell you what. You'll figure it out. He poured a 3rd cup and held it out to Vex's car. Vex's car looked at the cup, looked at the man. General Dowway, the man said. Not as an introduction. As a clarification, as if Vex's car might have been wondering what to call him and deserved the answer. Vex's car took the cup. Sat down. He did not know why he sat down. He had not made a decision to sit down. His body had simply arrived at the floor, and that had been that. And he was not the kind of man that happened to. And yet here he was, sitting on the floor of an empty museum wing at the edge of mapped space, holding a warm cup of something, and next to him Sorenelle was holding her own cup, and looking at Dowway with the expression she reserved for intelligence sources who had more than she expected. Dowway sat across from them, old knees, slow descent. He settled and looked at the empty cases the way they had been looking at them. Not with satisfaction, not with threat, with something more like tiredness. How long has this station been here? Sorenelle asked. The first section was built 340 years ago, Dowway said. We've added to it since. The first section, she said, meaning this wing. No, he said, this wing is new, relatively. He looked at the empty cases. We hoped we wouldn't need it. The room was quiet for a while. Vex's car looked at his cup, drank from it. He didn't ask what it was. It was warm, and it was slightly bitter. And it was the first thing he'd had since leaving the station that his body processed as food rather than fuel. You built this for us, he said. Not a question. The museum, you built it to show us. We built it to remember, Dowway said. Showing you is secondary. He turned the cup in his hands. We've shown it to others, quietly, over the years. Species that were deciding whether to align with the Empire or find other arrangements. We don't tell them what to decide. We just show them the record. How many species have seen this? Dowway looked at him with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. Enough, Sorenelle said. The transmission. We've been waiting. What were you waiting for? The old man was quiet for a moment. Not because he didn't have the answer, because he was deciding how much of it to give. We were waiting, he said. For you to be ready to look. He looked at Vex's car. You came without authorization. That matters. That's a person choosing to know something instead of being told what to know. We needed to know if the Empire could still produce people like that. And if we couldn't, then the empty wing would have a label, Dao said. Very simply, and a date. The room held that. Vex's car did not look at the cases. He looked at the old man, at the tiredness in him, not defeat, not satisfaction. The tiredness of someone who has carried a thing for a very long time, and is now, finally, at the part where someone else knows about the weight. We never wanted a war, Dao said. We wanted you to choose not to have one. He picked up his thermos. That's still what we want. And if the Praetor doesn't choose that, Dao poured himself more tea, didn't answer immediately, looked at his cup. Then the record will be complete, he said. Outside the viewport at the far end of the wing, space was the same as it always was. Dark, indifferent, patient. The stars holding their positions across distances too large to mean anything and too large to ignore. And somewhere among them, hundreds of millions of people on ships without transponders moving through the black, waiting to go home. Vex's car drank his tea. He thought about the Veith wing. The photograph Soren L. had stopped in front of. The burn mark on the treaty document. He thought about the empty cases and what they were counting. He finished the cup and put it down carefully, and looked at this tired old man from a planet not in any record, and understood, in the specific way that understanding arrives when it is too late to be comfortable, that this conversation was not the plan. This conversation was the mercy built into the plan. The plan didn't require him to understand. He was here because they had hoped he might. Malethune had not slept either. Not in the disciplined way Soren L. didn't sleep. Not because the work demanded it. Because the particular machinery of his mind, the one that had run the Empire for 22 years on a combination of information control and political timing, had stopped producing clean outputs and was producing noise instead. The same fragment cycling, an empty planet, a lit-up moon, a card on a table that nobody touched, a transmission with 2 sentences and a choice built into them. Come if you want to understand. He had not come. He had sent a drone. The drone had arrived at the coordinates and found the station and begun its passive scan, and then its feed had cut out, not destroyed, not jammed. The drone had simply turned around and come home, its mission subroutines intact, its sensors intact, every system green. It had turned around the way a dog turns around at a particular smell, some deep code instruction tripping that Malethune's technical team spent 4 hours trying to locate and could not. They had sent a machine. The machine had been sent back. He thought about that, about the precision of it, not destroying the drone, which would have been a provocation, not jamming it, which would have been detectable, just redirecting it, a gesture that said, "This is not how this works." A lesson delivered without a word. He had been on the receiving end of that kind of move exactly once before, 26 years ago, when he was still a young counselor watching the previous Praetor navigate a coalition dispute. The previous Praetor had said, "You can always tell the quality of an opponent by how they say no. A weak opponent slams the door. A strong one just stops opening it." He pushed the thought away. He pulled up the military assessment instead. Fleet position, weapons status, Earth's coordinates still active on the targeting overlay. The planet was empty. They knew it was empty. Orev Dawn had confirmed it 6 ways, but the targeting overlay didn't know what empty meant. It knew coordinates and yield calculations and projected damage assessments. The numbers were clean. That was the problem. Soren L. had told him the numbers were wrong. But she wasn't here to tell him again, because she had gone to the coordinates herself, disobeying a direct instruction, sitting somewhere at the edge of map space with a man not in any record. And Vex's car was there too, his 2 most reliable people, at the table he hadn't been willing to sit at, leaving him with the numbers. Counselor Drethvon came in at 0800 and put a fresh assessment on the desk and said the window for a show of force strike was narrowing, that waiting longer sent a signal of its own, that the Empire's allied states were watching, and the watching had a cost. Malethune looked at the assessment. The numbers were still clean. He approved the strike. Orev Dan received the order aboard the Bright Dominion, and read it twice, and then set it down on the console in front of her, and looked at it with an expression her bridge crew did not see, because she had turned her chair slightly away from them to read it. She thought about the transmission, the 2 sentences, the choice. She thought about the warm food in the Moon Installation's kitchen, and the foot traffic patterns in soft ground at the transport hubs, orderly lines going in one direction, nobody running. She thought about what Vex's car had said before he left. Whatever is at those coordinates had been built for this exact moment. She picked up the order and authorized it and gave the command, Because she was a captain of the Imperial fleet and she had taken an oath and she had not yet arrived at the place Vex Carr had arrived at when he walked to his shuttle bay at 0300. She was not sure she would ever forgive herself for that. She gave the command. 17 ships opened fire on an empty planet. The volley was full yield. Every weapons platform on all 17 ships, firing in coordinated sequence the way the Imperial fleet had been drilling for 300 years. Overlapping strike patterns, maximum coverage, the kind of coordinated firepower that had ended civilizations and broken moons, and turned the tide of every serious conflict the Empire had faced. Since its first expansion, it hit Earth, and Earth did something with it. The first indication was the light. Not the expected light of surface detonations. That was there, briefly, the initial impact bloom, but something else, rising from beneath. From the crust itself. A grid of illumination spreading outward from every impact point simultaneously, like a network waking up. Like something buried very deep and very deliberately, receiving exactly what it had been designed to receive. The weapons fire went in. The grid took it, not deflection, not reflection. The energy didn't bounce, it was pulled, drawn down into the surface along channels that the fleet's sensors were only now detecting because they were only now active. A latticework of some material running through the top kilometer of Earth's crust like roots, like veins, like the infrastructure of something that had been growing underground for 30 years. While its architects went about their surface lives above it. The planet ate the fire, all of it. Orev Dawn watched the sensor readings and did not speak, and her bridge crew did not speak, and the silence on the bright Dominion had a specific texture, not the silence of waiting, not the silence of shock, but the silence of people who have just understood that the thing they were doing was never going to do what they thought it was going to do, and had in fact been anticipated, and planned for, and prepared against, and that the preparation was 30 years old. The planet glowed. Every impact site, every grid node, pulsing with the energy it had just absorbed, the whole surface lit from beneath like a thing that was alive, which it was in a way, in the way that anything becomes alive when given enough intention and enough time. Then it stopped. The light went out. Clean all at once. Like a held breath released, Earth sat in the dark the same as it had before the strike. Same atmosphere, same oceans, same cloud cover drifting across the same land masses, undamaged, unchanged. 17 ships had just fired everything they had at it. It had not noticed. Malethun received Orev Dawn's report 18 minutes after the strike. He read it. He read the sensor data attached to it, the grid readings, the energy absorption calculations, the post-strike surface assessment. He read the number at the bottom, the yield of the combined strike, expressed in a unit that had always before been followed by the word destruction. And he read what that yield had produced, which was nothing, and he sat with that for a while. He had approved the strike as a show of force. The show of force had demonstrated, with complete precision, that force was a thing he did not have, not because the Empire was weak. The Empire was not weak. The Empire had the most powerful fleet in known space and had just fired it at a planet. The planet had eaten it. He stood up, walked to his viewport. The station's rotation was bringing the star field into view, the same stars, the same indifferent dark, and out there somewhere Vex Carr and Soren L were sitting in a museum they hadn't built, drinking tea with a man not in any record, understanding things he had chosen not to go and understand. He had sent a drone, he thought, with a clarity that arrived too late and too completely. That was the test. The choice was the test, not the coordinates, not the museum, the choice. Come or don't, understand or don't. And I sent a drone. His comm chimed, 14 signals, simultaneous near enough. He knew the origin codes before he opened them, 14 allied states, 14 independent species, who maintained relationships with the Empire that were called partnerships and were actually a more comfortable word for deference. 14 species who received Imperial protection in exchange for Imperial access to their resources and their trade routes and their political support in the Galactic Councils. He opened the first one. It was short, diplomatically worded, the way things that have already been decided are diplomatically worded, the language of a choice communicated rather than discussed. The Vithran Collective was suspending its trade agreement with the Empire pending review. No hostility, no alliance broken, just, we are stepping back. He opened the second, the third. He stopped opening them after 7 because they were all the same message in different diplomatic language, and he understood the shape of what was happening. They had been watching, not just today, not just the strike. The 14 observer ships. He had known about them. Soren L had flagged possible observer presence in her last report before she left had been positioned before the blockade fleet arrived. They had watched the empty planet, the lit moon, The orderly departure of a civilization that knew exactly where it was going. They had watched 17 Imperial ships fire on an empty world, and now they were stepping back, one by one, quietly, the way you step away from something you have decided you don't want to be associated with, not dramatically, not with declarations, just distance measured, polite, irreversible. Maleth Un stood at his viewport and watched the star field and understood what he was feeling only because he had felt it once before, a long time ago, before the career in the office and the 22 years of being the last word on every subject. He had felt it as a child, the one time he had been caught in a lie, not a small lie, a significant one, the kind that a child tells because they can't yet see how large the thing they're lying about actually is. He had felt the particular exposure of it, the moment when the lie stops working and what's underneath it is visible. He was the most powerful political figure in the known galaxy. He felt exactly like that child. The transmission from Commander Osi began broadcasting 40 minutes after the strike. It went out on every standard galactic communication frequency simultaneously, which meant it had been pre-recorded and pre-scheduled, which meant she had known the strike was coming, which at this point surprised no one who was paying attention. It was not a declaration of war. It was not a list of demands. It was the museum, all of it, the records, the testimonies, the wings with their labels and their dates, the artifacts in their cases, the photograph of the city that had been a city. Everything documented and compressed and transmitted in a format that any species with basic receiver technology could access and read in their own language, because the translation matrix had been prepared in advance for all of them. And at the end, before the footage of Earth absorbing the strike, which was there, clean sensor footage, unedited, the grid lighting up and the planet glowing and going dark again undamaged. At the end there was a single text frame. One question. What kind of galaxy do you want to live in? No signature, no demand, no deadline, just the question sitting in the broadcast the way the empty museum wing sat in the station, prepared, patient, waiting for whoever was ready to answer it. Vex Carr and Sorenel heard the broadcast on their shuttle on the way back. They listened to all of it. Neither of them spoke during it. When it ended, Sorenel turned the audio off and they sat in the quiet of transit for a while, the shuttle moving through the dark toward a command station that was going to be a different place than it had been when they left it. He struck, Vex Carr said. Not a question. Yes, she said. He looked out the small viewport. Stars that didn't move, the Allied states. Stepping back, she said. I'd expect most of them within the week. He nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone surprised. The nod of someone confirming a shape they had already seen. She said 30 years, he said. Dao Wei, the grid, 30 years. At least, Sorenel said. The station is 340 years, he said. To build a museum. To place people inside our administration. To clean up a debris field and hide a civilization in plain sight and install an energy grid in a planet's crust. He paused, and we fired at it. Sorenel said nothing for a moment. Then, we were given the choice not to. The shuttle ran on. Behind them, somewhere in the dark, the station sat at the edge of everything with its soft lights and its warm-lit wings and its empty cases, waiting patiently for contents that, now, might not come. Dao Wei had refilled the cups before they left, had not walked them out, had stayed sitting, cross-legged, looking at the empty wing with his thermos in his lap. The specific stillness of a man who has done what he set out to do, and is now letting the world do what it will with it. He had not said goodbye, he had said, give it time. On Earth, and people were already going back. The lights that had never gone off now joined by the lights of returning ships. Cities breathing back to life the way cities do when the people who belong to them come home. Commander Yara Ose sat in a transport bay and watched the feeds, the Allied states, the broadcast, the 17 Imperial ships sitting in orbit around an undamaged planet with their targeting systems, dark, waiting for orders that were not coming because the man who gave orders was standing at a viewport somewhere understanding something that couldn't be ununderstood. She had a cup of something too, not Dao Wei's tea, her own, something from home. She drank it and watched the feeds, and her face was the face of someone who is not surprised and is not celebrating, because the people who make the long plans are never surprised when they work, and never quite able to celebrate them either. The plan working was not the point. The plan working meant the worst thing hadn't happened. That wasn't joy. That was relief, which was a different and quieter thing. Her calm showed a message from Dao Wei, 3 words. Lights are on. She looked at the feet of Earth. The cities coming back, the grid still faintly warm in the crust beneath them, the ships settling into landing patterns with the practiced ease of people who had rehearsed the return trip the same number of times they had rehearsed the departure. She typed back 2 words. Coming home. The final strike had not been the grid eating the Empire's weapons fire. The final strike had been 30 years ago, when the first load of material went into the ground and the first parameter was set, and the first decision was made to build something that said, "We will not fight you with fire. We will make fire irrelevant." It had been 340 years ago, when the first wing of the museum was built and someone had decided that memory was the only weapon that mattered in the end. Not the memory of your own history, but the capacity to hold the history of others, to refuse to let it disappear the way the empire disappeared things it didn't want remembered. It had been 800 years ago, when the first quiet hand had quietly misfiled the first quiet report, and a civilization had looked at the largest empire in the known galaxy and decided, "Not yet, not like this. We will wait until we are ready. We will wait until they are ready. We will wait until the choice is real." The empire would not fall today. Empires didn't fall in a day. They contracted, they reassessed, they reformed or they didn't, and the galaxy watched either way, and the record was kept either way. The empty wing remained empty. The question remained in the broadcast, patient as everything else had been patient, waiting for the galaxy to answer it in the only way that mattered, not in words but in the slow accumulation of choices made by people who had been shown, finally clearly, without cruelty, what the record actually said. The lights were on. The people were coming home. The stars held their positions the way they always did, and always would, full of things not yet in any record, patient in the way that only very large and very old things can be patient. Not because patience is easy, but because they have learned, over a very long time, that it is the only thing that lasts.